And today it's the Master Coach Challenge. We've got three amazing master coaches, and now we get to dive into a special segment, our panel with these coaches. We're going to pose some of these questions, and I'm going to grab one right out of Facebook right away. Dave Scott, how do I find the perfect running shoe for my running style? What a great question we all have on the mind.
Yeah, that's a real good question. I think probably the easiest thing is that you need someone. A lot of the technical shops that are still in business have a treadmill, and they can look at your biomechanics, your flexibility in your hips, your back, your shoulders, what sort of movement patterns you have, and what your foot strike looks like. Also, you need to look at your total body weight because that affects your cushioning. And some folks have a natural tendency to overpronate, where they get kind of sloppy. Sometimes we see supination as well. So I really think the best way to do it is to come into a running shop slightly fatigued. Don't come in fresh, or you put on some miles. Try their shoes based on your body type and just the variables that I mentioned. Then you'll be able to select either a stability shoe, a neutral shoe, or a lighter weight shoe. And quite often athletes will rotate shoes. So if you can afford to get two pair and or possibly a lighter weight one when you're racing, and of course you've got to do due diligence in those shoes and not just put them on race day. You've got to practice in them. But yeah, those are my tips. I think it really takes someone to look at you from a front profile shot, looking at both sides so you can watch the arm action as well, and then also look at your foot pattern.
Wow, great answer. So, I mean, the first thing that jumped out at me, we talk about shoes, and you mentioned the upper body. So we'll jump up to Mark. Talk about this. We're going to talk about upper body and how that affects the running. Like Dave said, shoulders. He mentioned, and that how can we address that?
Well, one thing to keep in mind is that as a triathlete, you do have a more developed upper body than, say, a pure runner. And so you can actually use that to your advantage. Use your arms to carry your momentum. And I kind of like to think of my upper body when I'm running as, think about if you had a plate around your waist that's sort of a saucer or something that was like the lower part of where you don't want your arms to go below. So, a lot of people that they've got a little too open of an arm carriage, and so when their arms come down, it goes below that plate that would be at your waist level, or maybe their arms are coming out too far in front of them. Think of it this way: you've got that plate around your lower body, around your waist. You don't want your arms to drop below that as you're doing your stride. And then think about if you had two fairly heavy rocks in your hand. If you're running along with rocks in your hand, where are you going to hold them so that you're efficient? You're not going to swing it way out because all of a sudden that is very heavy. So you want to kind of hold it a little bit closer to your chest and just have that rocking carriage help you carry your momentum. And so, the third thing is to think about your head actually as being sort of like a real stable platform, so that you want your head to just be moving in a pretty steady line, not a lot of up and down motion. But that rotation from your upper body is what, again, carries that momentum and helps you move your legs, which are going on obviously below you. If you feel like your stride cadence, your stroke rate on your legs is getting to be too slow, you can pick it up by using your arms to carry that momentum.
Super great. Let's shift gears right into the bike here. We'll go to Lance. We'll just kind of try and follow along in order here. But now Lance in the center. I'm going to ask you this. We see a lot of folks on the trainer the last 23 weeks, and there's one out of probably 5 that stay in the Aerobars. There's no aero advantage. Tell me real quick how that position, are we riding in an optimal position if we can't stay in the Aerobars on a trainer? Does that question make sense? Just why are so many people having to sit up, pop up, stand up, all this stuff?
Yeah, so multi-layered question, I guess. First of all, if an athlete can ride on the trainer in their Aerobars, that's probably an indication that they're very comfortable in their setup. So that's good feedback for the athletes. observed over the years that some athletes are able to generate more power when they're in that aero position, and some are able to generate more power when they're sitting upright, perhaps on a road bike versus a time trial bike too. So you're always trying to find that balance between power output and aerodynamic speed. And if you can sort of marry both concepts optimally, then you're going to get the fastest possible athlete. Now, when you're bent forward in that aero position, you are putting more stretch on your low back and on your glutes. And I tend to find that athletes, a lot of times their aero position is a little bit more forward too, so they start to use their quads a little bit more than their glutes. So that may identify an area where an athlete is either developmentally or maybe even genetically stronger through, say, their quadricep muscles in the fronts of their quads versus their hamstrings or their glutes. Whereas if you tend to ride on a road bike, you tend to be more upright. You tend to push forward on the pedals a little bit more, relative your body angle to the pressure points on the pedals. So then you will engage your glutes and your hamstrings more. Personally, I like to ride my road bike on the trainer just because it's comfortable and and I don't have a race on the horizon right now, but I definitely will have my athletes start to do more and more TT work on the road, but particularly on the trainer because you can really lock and load that position. And of course, there's the whole safety element of, riding Ruvi on your aero bars. You can actually stay in that aero position and train those race specific muscle angles and adapt the back to being in that position as well.
Awesome answer. I kind of want to piggyback on that as I go to Dave. You mentioned some of the stuff earlier. Talk to us about staying seated, changing the cadence to high or low in a race. Some advantages maybe from those approaches that you mentioned.
Well, I think first off, on standing position, you see a lot of people that have a tendency to come forward. Lance was just talking about forward and aft position with a TT bike and a road bike. And a lot of people that are on a TT bike is generally, as you come forward, you have a little more weight on your hands depending on your setup. So as you move forward, there's less movement from side to side, and you end up running on the pedals, which really loads your quad. So people need to practice standing on their TT bike outside, even on a false flat or general hill, so that they're actually feeling as though they get a little bit of rock from side to side. They can actually use the inside palm of their hand to allow that bike to move from side to side. But initially, when they come off the saddle standing, they just want to sort of levitate off that saddle and not try to come too far forward. And again, the tendency is to push your hips too far forward, and people's quads load up. And I'll use Joanna Zeiger as a reference. I coached her way back when she was on her first Olympic team in 2000 in Sydney. And I'm obviously a firm believer in intermixing standing and seating. Seated position, and she couldn't stand up for more than about a minute. It would just load her quads too much, and that was part of the problem, is that she was just too far forward. So we would do these long, kind of slow, methodical segments, bigger gear, just to see if I could get her out of the saddle. So Mike, coming back to your question, I think it's really paramount that people intermix standing and seated, and they'll find that it does stretch your back out a little bit. It opens up your hip flexors, and certainly in the 70.3, an Ironman distance race, to stay in aero position the whole time could really be catastrophic when you get to the run. You're just going to feel so bound up that you're unable to stand up nice and tall. And we see a lot of athletes that are kind of forward flexed getting off the bike because they're just so darn tight. So alleviating that position, standing, seating, and let's just use the Kona chorus. Mark and I had different riding styles, but we both stood up. I couldn't see him a lot of the time. He was always right there behind me, and that kind of bothered me. I wish he'd come up next to me so I could really look at him. But as we're riding, we're coming out of the saddle for all the reasons that we're talking about. So we're able to run the marathon on the end. The variable gearing that I mentioned at the outset is to try to change the gearing range. So for example, if you're doing a set, and this is one of the sets that I did on the strength set, it was a 9 times 3 minutes. And if people know their FTP, and let's just pull out a number, let's say it's 200 watts, and the 9 times 3 minutes is broken up in equal segments of low gear, big gear, and a time trial gear, are you able to hold FTP in a lower gear, faster legs, or in a bigger gear, seated or standing? Well, a lot of people will load up, they'll develop muscle tension, they'll start producing the muscle acidity too quickly, and they just want to gravitate right back to their choice gear. But if you incorporate this in your training where you have this variable gear in low gear, big gear, time trial gear, and you're working at higher workloads, not just aerobically, it'll be a huge asset when you race that you may just go up one cog. And I'm not talking about really maximizing load in your training sessions as you can do, but just subtle changes when you're racing and developing that economy and efficiency in and out of your saddle and going to a quicker cadence will really help you overall and help you on the run.
Excellent. Awesome answer there. So folks, take notes here. He just said help on the run. So the next question for you, Mark. Hey, coaches, how would you suggest incorporating brick workouts when training virtually or partially indoors?
Yeah, brick workouts, Mr. Michael Lovato, are really key, as you know. They actually, I never did them actually until around 1988, 1989, and I just assumed that okay, I do a long bike ride on Saturdays, a long run on Sundays, and that gets me ready for Kona. Well, what I was patterning into my body by not doing brick workouts was that when I was done with my long bike ride, it was time for lunch and a nap. And so what happened when I got to the Ironman Kona? Well, I wasn't ready for a marathon. I was ready for my lunch and a nap. And, Mr. Dave Scott was pulling away and making it look like, no, come on, buddy. Lunch and a nap is for the lazy guys. I stood up on the bike the entire way. I'm ready to run. And so finally I realized, okay, I have to train my body to not only be able to transition from cycling muscles to running muscles, which even though they're both using your legs, they're slightly different. A cycling motion it's a fairly restricted range of motion. It's not, you're not opening up to anything that's going to stretch your muscle to the max. When you get out there on the run, all of a sudden your stride is opening up you're opening up that hip angle. Obviously you were down in the aero position for all that time. When you stand up and you start running, if it's super tight and you're not used to transitioning, it can take you a long time to actually get into a smooth running stride. So I incorporated brick workouts finally in 1989, and it paid off. Interestingly, people.
That's too bad.
Yeah, well, and Dave was commenting that you got to get used to standing up and on the bike. Well, he was just kind of a stiffy. He couldn't stay down in an aero position. I was like loose and supple and was able to just stay in that aero position for so much longer, so that when I got to the run, it was just natural and easy for me to get going. But anyway, I'm just joking with all of you. And by the way, Michael Lovato, I was really worried about you today because without Dee Dee Greasebarrow to make you look good and to give you the prompts, I didn't know if you could carry the show on your own, but you are doing an amazing job. But anyway, all of you listening, in all seriousness, brick workouts, they're not training you to have the endurance to do that marathon. They're training you to do the transition from bike to run and to pattern into your body that cue that when you get off the bike, there's going to be something coming up. So a brick run doesn't have to be any more than, let's say, 20 minutes or 30 minutes. That will help you transition to train that transition so that you get into your running stride, you get into a nice supple motion right away off of the bike. And that will then enhance your entire run portion of a triathlon, whether it's a 10K, half marathon, or a full marathon.
Well, without this trash talk segment, I don't think I could carry on without Dee Dee. But I'm gonna draw out here and just go to Lance with a question that's very interesting. I'm not sure we've heard this one before, but if you ride your bicycle on the white line striped on the road there, will that decrease the rolling resistance? Is that something you could do? Just drop that rolling resistance jumping on that white line.
Well, the 18 scientific journals I read on riding on the white line point to, yeah, so I'm always looking, if it's a closed road, you're always looking for the smoothest section of the road, whether it's where the paint is or the fresh pavement, etc. I I don't think I could advocate riding on the white line from a safety perspective as a coach, but as far as like maybe keeping focused and practicing riding a straight line, which is if you ride with other people, it's nice to be predictable. That's a good skill to work on as well. And then of course I just have to say, like, you avoid the white line if it's raining out, because that paint on the road tends to be the slippery spot, especially if you're cornering or whatever. But yeah, good for mental focus. And if there's no potholes on the white line, go for the white line.
Good answers. Now it's a tricky one. So looking at that white line as we watch Dave come across that line first there in Kona. I'll ask you this, Dave, another question from our crew, but a good one I think you'll hit well. What about the gym, the standard workouts, traditional squats or deadlifts? Is there a place for that stuff with our triathlon Ironman training?
I think absolutely. I get a lot of athletes that say, I love doing squats. And the problem is that they're not able to activate their gluteals. So they really need to come back. The prerequisite in doing squats, because you're not in hip extension. And if you sit back, you do engage your glutes doing a squat exercise. But a lot of the triathletes that are up on their forefoot will find when they're doing just what looks like a good squat is all lateral quad. So I like, as a prerequisite, to do gluteal specific exercises and then gravitate to a wider stance squat. And there's different types of squats that are very effective in engaging your glutes a little bit more. And that's really the key element on it. So I like a lot of the traditional lifts. I like a lot of the power lifts as well. And the other area that I think a lot of the triathletes are premature on, and I'm a big advocate, is doing plyometrics. You want to make sure that you have really good core strength to begin with, and the same prerequisite that I just mentioned for the squats. So I think plyometric squats have a definite benefit. I would do the squats more as a power type movement, so don't go overly heavy on those. Somewhere between 8 to 15 repetitions, a little bit faster and slightly lighter weight. But they're a real plus, and plyometrics are too. But I'm a big advocate of actually working on the smaller support muscles. When you look at your glute muscles, it's a pretty complex muscle that sits there on that fatty tissue. So I like to do it in all different ranges so that you're really optimizing your glute strength, and that generally affects your core stability and strength as well. And that's always a prerequisite before squats.